How common has it become for people to advocate for religion on account of its supposed cultural value? How often do you see people arguing for Christianity, Islam, or Judaism because these religions provide a good system of morals, a good set of rules they happen to agree with, or that they are tied innately to a set of historical cultures, or even, to be most crude of all, a set of political persuasions? What, furthermore, has been your experience of the vast majority of debate about religion? If I had to hedge a bet, I'd say whether in online debates or arguments over the Thanksgiving turkey, or even late night conversations with your friends, the most common conception of religion that people usually go in for and discuss is, in a word, legislative. That is, religion is typically thought to be nothing more than a set of rules and doctrines, and you're religious to the extent that you follow these laws and assent to these doctrines, and you're irreligious to the extent that you don't. Moreover, in the case of theistic religion at least, the basis for these rules and doctrines is an all-powerful God, a sort of supreme monarch who determines things be this way and not that. Again, the same thinking applies. To be religious is just to be obedient to this cosmic autocrat, to sort of whip your behaviour and your beliefs and your attitudes into shape in order to line them up with whatsoever you think this great being is telling you to do. And a lot of this is enforced by means of a supposed divine emotional temperament. God is pleased with you and happy with you if you worship him and obey his commandments, and he's very displeased and even wrathful if you fail to. Although this seems to be the most common picture of faith, it's also one that is sadly and quite obviously flawed. What's primarily incorrect and in effect harmful is its a blatant misrepresentation of the God of classical theism. What these debates tend to engage is just sort of a supernatural being who just happens to be in possession of a great deal more power, an infinite amount of power in comparison with human beings. It is much more like a god of the local pagan variety, and behaviour toward this god is again like the ancient Greeks or Romans would have acted toward their gods, which is you work to please the god and not displease them in order to allow your own life to go smoothly. In short, that is, the vast majority of contemporary debates that I see between apologists and atheists concern themselves with the God that really has no real relation at all to the God of classical theism, the God of the established traditions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Hinduism, so on and so forth. The very basis of classical theism is that it recognizes and acknowledges the contingency of created things, and thereby reasons to a yet greater and ultimately infinite ground of being for those contingent things, which it happens to call God. Importantly, it doesn't matter whether that being is either an angel, like supernatural being, or an atom, or even a god with a lowercase g, just some being that exists out there somewhere in the universe. If something exists in the way that you and I and everything else exists, within the conditioned manifold, relating to other things, it requires yet greater being to depend on, some unconditioned source and essence for its being. That's the basic logical move that classical theism makes. As such, that ultimate ground of being cannot be something that, like, firstly, is a being in any real sense, in the sense of having a delimited form and location within space and time. But moreover, it also can't have feelings. It can't be temperamental. It can't get jealous or angry or happy in the way that human beings might. If it did, it would be passable. It would be capable of suffering. It would be capable of feeling in general, and so changing. And if it were capable of changing, it wouldn't be that unchanging, immutable ground at the centre of all things. Certainly it could exist, but then you'd need something bigger to explain it, so it wouldn't be God in the sense of an ultimate creator. So contemporary atheists and apologists seem ultimately to treat religion as nothing but a propositional ideology. You believe this, you don't believe that, you believe this, you don't believe that. And then that's the end of the story. And yet in so doing, we completely miss the real purpose and meaning of religious faith. In fact, far from being the full story, this more moralistic, legislative, doctrinal, propositional form of religion might better be understood as sort of a lower tier, almost, a first or preliminary stage through which one enters at first and then gravitates towards something that necessarily transcends it. Yes, it's certainly true that we need those sort of concrete propositions and creeds and doctrines in order to get a foothold and begin to engage and belong to a tradition and comport ourselves toward ultimate reality. But crucially, there also comes a point when clinging to these things dogmatically can become not a useful entry point, but in fact an obstacle to gravitating toward the heart of religious and specifically theistic faith. What needs to happen in the course of a religious life is a tangible, visible shift away from particular doctrines and precepts and towards something slightly more elusive and slightly less grounded in proposition and legality, but because of that very reason, something more universal and therefore true to an ultimate creator God. The first thing to do, as I've already suggested, is to change the faulty metaphysics that we have picked up so far. Again, this way of conceiving God and religion as sort of just a strict headmaster who says do this and don't do this can be a useful first step and can be a useful foothold in the religion, and usefully, of course, enforces moral behaviour, but we need to know when to give it up. Not just because it's wrong, but because it can be actively dangerous when we start to think of God as just some tribal leader who tells us to do this and that. Our relationship to God should not resemble that of a relationship to simply a virtuous king or president. One of the important characteristics that people do need to appreciate is that God is immanent to creation as well as being transcendent of it. That is to say, the world and God do not exist in some sort of dualistic relation, but God is both transcendent of it in not being a being amongst beings, like, some local God, but also he's within it, absolutely. The very interior essence of everything that is, and here's the kicker, the very inner essence of you. Some people get very guarded and a bit prickly at this point and say that that suggestion that our relationship to God is ultimately non-dual is Eastern and is not Christian or Jewish or Muslim in nature. And yet, if we look closely at the historical traditions of Christianity, Islam and Judaism, we see they are replete with that inner nectar of true religious devotion, mysticism. The reason you have to clarify your metaphysics is because the metaphysics of classical theism, if you look closely, lead us to mysticism. Most people, for instance, say that monotheism is just the claim that there's one God amongst many possible, but the many possible don't exist in this case. But that's not quite true to the monotheisms of the Abrahamic religions. What they're saying is that the source and the creator, as is the common term of existence, has to be singular. It has to be one that gives rise to everything else that is different. And to further the point, because God isn't just a being amongst beings somewhere up there in the sky, in heaven, but is the being of everything that exists, with a capital B, he is also infinitely and absolutely present in all things. To reprise an analogy from an earlier video, if creation is a book, then God is not just something within that book. He's not the first word or the first page, or even at the very end of the book and the last page. He's instead the author, which is to say that without which the book could not be. Not a thing in the book there, but the logos, the essence flowing through it all. And so if you read any aspect of the book, even down to the smallest letter, or even as large as the whole book itself, in both cases we have an absolute dependence upon the author. As such, the very inner essence, we might say, of that book is its author. What it truly is at heart is not anything that can be explained within the constituents of the book. And so if parts of the book we're trying to discover, or we were trying to discover where the parts of the book came from, we would have to look through them into their interior essence, which is the author. Many people are hostile to mysticism precisely because they don't grasp the basic metaphysics of classical theism, which in turn lead us to a mystical attitude. So, what changes in our relationship to the world through the realm of mysticism? Well, put simply, everything. The reason that religion that gets stuck in the first preliminary tier is so dull and uninspiring for many people, and indeed often results in religious violence, is because it deals in, categorically, external objects. It seeks fulfillment in those external objects just the same as secular people, as people who have no religion at all, seek fulfillment in a set of external conditions. Just because those external conditions, in the case of religious people, happen to be sacred texts or liturgical practices or sacred beliefs, doesn't change the fact that these things are external to us, so long as we don't reflect on the internal source. So long as we deal in particular parts of being, like a particular object or a particular practice or a particular belief or sacred text, we're still dealing with an object. What really needs to change is the turn inward to experience the experience which encompasses all those particular objects. The being, capital B, that encompasses and grounds all particular beings. This lower stratum or tier of religion can at best set up boundaries around your spiritual journey, giving you basic rules to fall back on, but a space essentially to march forward. But to be mystical is to seek an inner silence and an inner unity that can only be sought on its own terms. Something that encompasses and enfolds everything, but isn't any particular thing itself. That is what we call God in the classical theistic traditions, not just some man in the sky who we form a relationship to in the same way we form a relationship to a headmaster or a king. When you start to embrace mysticism and practice it and understand it as the heart of religious practice, your relationship to the world is no longer born by a desire to find fulfillment in particular objects or external circumstances, but rather you begin by seeing the unity in all things, and then the particular objects that you experience in the world, whether that be money or wealth or relationships, are simply reflections of that unity. And quite beautifully, everything that you know is infinite in nature because you see God infinitely in everything, or at least you try your best to. Not an easy thing at all. I've by no means mastered it. But the point is, with true vision, you'll see that every single object is sort of a gratuitous addition, like a gift. Something that you don't need in the way that you might feel you need objects to make you happy in the lower form of religion or in secular life. Everything that you encounter becomes a surplus, an abundance, an overflowing of the cup, in addition to what you've already received, simply by recognizing your own being as always already enough. Mysticism, therefore, is inherently elusive in this respect because it doesn't begin with easily intelligible and established propositions or creeds or dogmas. Historically, this has resulted in a bit of tension between these two tiers of religion. A great many mystics, from Meister Eckhart to Mansur al-Hallaj, found themselves in hot water and, in the case of al-Hallaj, actually killed by religious authorities, precisely because their allegiance was not to a set of religious dogmas, but to the infinite unity that grounds and enfolds all of them, and so necessarily transcends particular doctrinal differences. It's hardly a surprise then that many mystics were inclusivist or even directly pluralist in their approach to other religious traditions. It's not to say that there are just no differences between faiths, of course, but only that those differences don't ultimately define your relationship to the being of all beings. If you draw a large triangle with smaller triangles within it, the inner contradictions of those smaller triangles are irreducible, and you can't just wash over them and pretend they're not there. But if you look at the biggest triangle of all, you see that all those differences, while not being reconcilable on their own terms, are still part of an overall unity. Importantly, this is a transcendence, but not a negation of those differences. The same goes for the relationship between the two tiers or strata of religion. When you move from the first to the second, you don't negate the first. You don't just directly say, I do not believe in these things anymore, but rather you transcend them. You cease clinging to them. You realize that the essence of religion is not in just propositional belief, but in your relationship to the world and its objects. You focus on how attached you are to the world, rather than just making a severe attachment to one religious proposition or creed, and then viciously fending off anyone who would attack it. If I can dare to be optimistic, my hope is that the future of the Abrahamic religions in particular resides in mysticism. For all the dogmatism of contemporary Salafi Islam, we have mystics like Ibn Arabi who say, beware of confining yourself to a particular belief and denying all else, because the knowledge of reality would elude you. For all the fundamentalist dualism of modern Christianity, we read mystics like Meister Eckhart, who says that you should sink your being you into God's being him, and your you and his him should become a single me. And for all the isolationist Judaism of today, we read that in Kabbalistic doctrine, the infinite transcends every particular content of faith. Because of the fine nuance involved here, and because it's a transcendence rather than a negation of the first tier of religion, what becomes especially difficult is trying to pass between these two forms. In the majority of cases, they both employ the very same language and terminology and symbolism inherent to their tradition when trying to explain their positions. For example, a Christian moralist and a Christian mystic will both use Jesus' crucifixion in their teaching. The moralist wants to use it to prove that God is a wrathful God who pours out his anger on creation, whilst the mystic wants to show it as the supreme display of love, the death of the ego in Christ, giving up his will to the Father in order to undergo this death and then rise again in God, a metaphor certainly for how mystics should look to live their life. So an outside viewer without the tools to pass between the two might think they're, just both Christian as they're both talking in exactly the same terms. They might thereby struggle to intuit the fact that these two are talking about radically different, indeed directly opposing attitudes toward the event of Jesus' crucifixion. It's this that I very often find myself having to clarify to skeptics and atheists who tend to lump all religion in together in one pile, or even those who dismiss mysticism as not being real religion, despite the fact that it's precisely the form of religion that we should be most adamantly promoting as what faith is actually about. And I say that with a certain urgency, because ours is an age, both in religious and irreligious circles, that is obsessed with external objects. And as you might have noticed, that makes people pretty miserable. To put it in the strongest possible terms, religion without mysticism is nothing. It is no more than a hollow husk, the sloughed skin of a snake. It's at best a cultural tool used for moral exhortation, something that's sort of culturally interesting. And again, sadly, that's how it's being advertised by a lot of people today. But at worst, it's a force that encourages stupidity and superstition and condones religious violence and tribalism. Religious history in general delves and rises with constant vacillation, with some ages imbibed with mysticism more than others. I think it's fair to say that ours is an age that is lacking, and I think it is time, high time indeed, for mysticism to make its return, and for our religious sensibilities to focus on God himself again. Thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing. This channel is looking to grow at the moment. Please do comment as well. I love speaking to all of you, especially if you disagree with me. And yeah, I wish you all the best. Happy Wednesday, everyone. Take care.